Jordan. On the origin and deeds of the Goths, the work, On the Origin and Deeds of the Goths, was written in Latin in early 551 by Jordan, when he was about 65 years old and Justinian had already been ruling for 24 years. The author is known from a single mention in the text itself. In his first profession as a notary, he worked for the Roman military commander Guntigus, or Gottadisclus, Baza, an assistant to Vislazarius, a Goth by nationality from the Amal clan, but with names of Hun origin. He was one of those who remained in Pannonia and did not follow Theodoric in his migration from Thrace to Italy. Jordan describes that he was born and spent his youth among the tribe of the Little Goths in Mysia, in the city of Nicopolis, in the foothills of Hemus, places where wine production was common, but the Little Goths did not know it and usually drank milk. It is assumed that he was a Goth, Ostrogoth, but Mommsen believes that Jordan was an Alan by his father's side, who lived among the Goths. A number of other manuscripts note that the author of Getica and Romana was the Bishop of Croton near Ravenna. Jordan knew Greek because he grew up in Thrace on the border between the two languages, Latin and Greek, as he himself wrote. It is believed that he wrote his works at the end of his life, when he was in Constantinople. He drew heavily on Cassiodorus' history of Theodoric's Roman Gothic state, which has not survived to this day. Jordan implies that Cassiodorus, for some nationalistic reasons, falsified history by exaggerating the role of the Goths and the royal family of the Amalids and artificially mixing the history of the Geti and Scythians into the history of the Goths. Thus, Jordan's history appears to be a kind of journalistic treatise, written on the political orders of the Amal dynasty during the turbulent era of attacks by the Bulgarians, Ants, and Slavs in the lands around the Danube River. In his preface, Jordanes announces the main theme of the history of the Goths, their division into two branches, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, and presents their movement across Europe in three sections. The crossing of the Goths from the island of Scandza, Scandinavia, to the mouth of the Vistula River, their movement southward, and their life on the northern Black Sea coast until the invasion of the Huns. B. The Visigoths who left the Black Sea coast via the Danube and their subsequent movement westward to Italy, Gaul, and Spain. C. The Ostrogoths who left the Black Sea coast after the Visigoths, their stay around the Danube in Mysia and Pannonia, and their settlement in Italy, describing the events of the most turbulent and complex period in the history of Europe during the early Middle Ages. Jordan describes numerous tribes, their alliances and states related to the history of Bulgaria and the Balkans, the state of Attila Han Bulgar, which is not mentioned as such by the author, the portrait of Attila, his wars, his death and burial, which confirm much of the information from the surviving ancient Bulgarian chronicles. On the origin and deeds of the Geta Jordanes de Origin Actibus Getarum Getica, Scandza lies opposite the Vistula River, which originates in the Sarmatian Mountains and flows into the North Sea in front of Scandza, separating Germany and Scythia from this very island of Scandza, like a workshop that produces tribes, or more precisely, like a womb that gives birth to nations, according to legend. The Goths once emerged with their king, named Barik. As soon as they disembarked from their ships and set foot on land, they gave this place its name. To this day, they say it is called Gothiscanza. They quickly moved into the lands of the Vimerungi, who then lived by the ocean, set up their camps there, and after defeating them, pushed them out of their settlements, then subjugated their neighbors, the Vandals, adding them to their victories. When a large number of people were born, and then the fifth king after Barig, Philomer, son of Gadarig, ruled, he ordered the Goths to leave here with their families. In search of suitable areas and places to settle, they entered the lands of the Scythians, who in their language called them Oyum. As victors, they moved to the farthest reaches of Scythia, which borders the Pontic Sea, which is sung about in their ancient songs, which resemble stories told to the people. And Josephus Flavius, who who most accurately conveyed the annals, observed the complete truth, and revealed the origin of the world from the very beginning, omitted for some unknown reason what we have said about the Goths. But he mentions that their roots are from Magog and claims that they are called Scythians, both by people and by name. Scythia borders Germany right next to the place where the Ister springs forth and Lake Mergen spreads out, reaching the Tira River, Dynastrum, and Vegasola, as well as the Great Dnieper and the Taurus Mountains, here Crimea, but not those in Asia, but the Scythian ones, lying on this side of the Meotida, and beyond the Meotida, through the Bosporus Strait to the Caucasus Mountains and the Arax River, and then turning left along the Caspian Sea, which reaches the extreme borders of Asnia and ends at the northeastern ocean in the form of a mushroom. Thin at the beginning and wide at the end, it reaches the Huns, borders the Albanians and the Syries. On that side, namely Scythia, elongated in length and open in width, to the east are the Syries, inhabiting the shores of the Caspian Sea from its very beginning. To the west are the Germans and the Vistula River. To the north it is surrounded by the ocean. To the south, Persia, Albania, Iberia, Pontus, and the lower reaches of the Ister, which is also called the Danube from its source to its mouth. On this side, which reaches the coast of Pontus, it is surrounded by the famous cities of Borysthenes, Albia, Callipolis, Chersonesus, Theodosia, Carrion, Myrmidon, and Trapezunt, which the rebellious Scythian peoples allowed the Greeks to build in order to conduct their trade. In the middle of Scythia, there's a place that separates Asia from Europe, the Rhipaean Mountains, from which the great Tanais springs, flowing into the Meotida. The circumference of this lake is 144,000 steps, and nowhere is it deeper than 8 cubits. In Scythia, the first people from the west are the Gepids, who are surrounded by large and famous rivers. To the north and northwest flows the Tigea. To the south flows only the wide Danube. To the east, the Flutavsis, which rushes and has many bends, flowing turbulently into the Ister. Between them lies Dacia, which is surrounded like a crown by the rocky Alps. From their left slope, which descends to the north, starting from the banks of the Vistula River, the peoples of the Veneti are located in endless spaces. Although their names change according to their tribes and localities, in principle they are called Sclavini and Anti. The Sclavini are found from the village of Noviatuns, and the lake called Murciano all the way to Danaster, north to Viskla, where they have swamps and forests instead of settlements. The Ants, who are the stronger of the two, are located from Danaster to Dnieper, where they form a bend near the Pontic Sea, and these two rivers are distant from each other but have many crossings. On the coast of the ocean, where the waters of the Vistula are taken in by 3 mouths, are located the Vitivari, gathered from various tribes, followed by the Estis, a completely peaceful people along the coast of the ocean. South of them lie the Agadzi, the strongest tribe among them, who do not know wheat, but feed on animals and hunting. After them, above the Pontic Sea, lie the native lands of the Bulgarians, who enjoy the worst reputation as the cause of our misfortunes. And there, the Huns, as the most fertile shoots of all the strongest tribes, boil and grow with double fury against the peoples. Some are called Algivarai, others Severi, but their settlements are far apart. The Algivarai are near Kherson, where the greedy merchant sells the riches of Asia, roaming the steppes in the summer, settling where there is pasture for the animals, and in winter they move to the Pontic Sea. The Hunigers are known for trading in rodent skins, whose numbers inspire fear with their bravery. The tribes mentioned above first settled in Scythia near Meotida, where, as is well known, they had a king named Philomer. But the next place in Dacia, Thrace, and Mysia was Zalmoxis himself, about whom many chroniclers testify that he had remarkable knowledge of philosophy. Therefore, among all the barbarians, the Goths were considered the most educated, almost on a par with the Greeks, as Dion writes, who compiled their history and genealogy in Greek. In the third region, near the Pontic Sea, having become more humane, as we have said, and more enlightened, they divided their people into two tribes. The Visigoths served the Balts, and the Ostrogoths served the Amals. This is the Tanais, which, flowing from the Rhipaean mountains, descends so powerfully that the neighboring rivers, and even the Syrtis and the Bosporus, freeze, but it is the only one of all the rivers, warmed by the vapors of the Rocky Mountains, that never freezes in the Scythian cold. The Danube emerges from a large marsh, flowing as if from a mother's womb. From here to its middle course, it is fresh and drinkable and feeds fish with excellent taste, without bones, but with only cartilage in their bodies. And as it approaches Pontus, a small river called Examphius flows into it, so bitter that the Nubius, which is navigable for 40 days, is so changed by this small tributary that it flows into the sea at the Greek cities of Calypida and Hippanes, already polluted and completely unlike itself. Near its mouth, opposite it, is the island named Achilles. Between them lies a vast land covered with forests and terrible swamps. After his death, when his army was on a campaign in other countries under his successors, a neighboring tribe attempted to capture the Gothic women as spoils. Trained by their men, they resisted fiercely and drove away their enemies in disgrace. Having achieved such a victory and relying on their still great courage and encouraging each other, they quickly armed themselves and chose two of the bravest women, Lampedo and Marpesia, as their leaders. The two, concerned that they should defend their possessions and ravage those of others, chose by lot for Lampedo to guard their native borders, while Marpesia gathered a militia of women and led this new army to Asia. She conquered various tribes in battle, annexed some, and after reaching the Caucasus, stopped for a while. She named this place Marpesia's Rock. Subsequently, Alexander the Great erected here the gates called the Caspian Gates, which are now maintained by the Lazzi for the protection of the Roman Empire. After staying here for some time, the Amazons strengthened their forces, leaving here and crossing the river Alus, which flows through the city of Gargara. They conquered Armenia, Syria, Cilicia, Galatia, Pisidia, and all the regions of Asia with equal success. Then, turning to the regions of Ionia and Aeolia, they made them their province. They ruled there for a long time and named the cities and fortresses after themselves. In Ephesus, they invested funds and built a temple to Diana of exceptional beauty because they shared the same passion for archery and hunting, an art to which they were devoted. In this way, the women native to Scythia took control of the kingdoms in Asia and held them for almost 100 years. But in the end, they returned to their compatriots near the rock of Marpesia in the Caucasus Mountains, which I mentioned above. Fearing that their offspring would diminish, they sought cohabitation with neighboring tribes, once a year organizing a gathering with those with whom, in the future, when all came on the same day for the same work, they would hand over the males to their fathers, while the mothers would train the females. Sometimes, if a woman wanted to, in the case of a boy being born, filled with hatred like a stepmother, they would end the life of the unfortunate boy. Thus, it was hateful for them to give birth to a boy, something that is desirable everywhere else. This cruelty, according to general opinion, increased the enormous fear of them. As they say, Hercules fought against them, defeating Melania more with cunning than with honor. Theseus captured Hippolyta as military spoils, from whom Hippolytus was born. These Amazons later had a queen named Penthesilea, who is famously mentioned during the Trojan War. As they say, these women held their kingdom until Alexander the Great. Don, a historian and the most diligent researcher of antiquity, who called his work Getica. These Geti, whom we recognized above as Goths, as Paul Orosius also claims. This Dion mentions their king named Telephus much later. This name does not seem to be in the Gothic language, but everyone knows and has noticed that it is common for most tribes to borrow large parts of names. From the Romans, Macedonian; from the Greeks, Roman; from the Sarmatians, Germanic. The Goths, on the other hand, borrowed mainly Hunnic names. This same Telephus, son of Hercules, born of Og, married the sister of Priam, was tall in stature, but even more formidable in strength. Equaling his father in valor, he resembled Hercules both in intellect and appearance. The kingdom of his ancestors was called Mysia. This province has the mouth of the Danube River to the east, Macedonia to the south, Istria to the west, and the Danube to the north. The aforementioned king waged war against the Danaans, in the battle with whom he killed the leader of the Greeks, Thesander, when he attacked Ajax and pursued Ulysses. His horse stumbled on vine branches and fell, and he was wounded in the thigh by Achilles' spear, from which he remained ill for a long time. But despite everything, even though he was wounded, he drove the Greeks from his borders. When Telephus died, his son Eurypylus, born of the sister of Priam, king of the Phrygians, succeeded him to the royal throne. Because of his love for Cassandra, he took part in the Trojan War and, in his efforts to help his parents and sister, died soon after his arrival. Then Cyrus, the king of the Persians, after a long period of time, almost 630 years later, during the reign of Thamyris, queen of the Geti, went to war against her. Arrogant from his victories in Asia, he sought to subjugate the Geti, over whom, as we have said, Thamyris was queen. Although she could have cut off Cyrus's path across the Abras River, she allowed him to pass, preferring to defeat him with weapons rather than pressuring him due to the convenience of the terrain, as it turned out. With the arrival of Cyrus, the first luck was on the side of the Parthians, who killed Thamyris' son and most of her army. But then the war resumed, and the Geti, led by their queen, subjugated and slaughtered the defeated Parthians, capturing a great deal of booty, and it was then that the Gothic tribes saw silk tents for the first time. Then Queen Thamyris, strengthened by her victory and the enormous spoils taken from her enemies, entered that part of Mysia which, taking its name from Great Scythia, is now called Little Scythia, and there, on the Mysian coast of Pontus, she built the city of Tomies, which she named after herself. After that, Darius, the king of the Persians, son of Hystaspes, wished to marry the daughter of Antir, king of the Goths, asked for her hand, and at the same time feared that his request might be rejected. The Goths did not approve of the marriage and left the embassy without an answer. After being rejected, he was enraged by the insult and raised 700,000 armed warriors against them to avenge his disgrace with widespread destruction. Near Chalcedon, all the way to Byzantium, he ordered his ships to be tied together like a bridge and thus crossed into Thrace and Mysia. He built a bridge across the Danube in the same way and, after wasting 2 months in a grueling war, lost 8,000 soldiers at Tapi. Then, fearing that the bridge over the Danube might be captured by the enemy, he hurried back to Thrace, considering it unsafe to linger even for a short time in Mysia. After Darius' death, his son Xerxes, considering himself obliged to avenge the insult to his father, went to war against the Goths with 700,000 of his own troops and 300,000 allied troops, with 200 beaked ships and 3,000 cargo ships. He did not even dare to engage in battle, already defeated by their determination. Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, formed a friendship with the Goths by marrying Medopa, the daughter of King Eudela, aiming to strengthen the Macedonian kingdom with such a union. Then, as Dion tells us, Philip suffered from a lack of money and decided, with the help of his army, to ravage the city of Odesitana in Mysia, which, being in the vicinity of Tomies, had submitted to the Goths. Therefore, the Gothic priests, who called themselves pure, immediately opened the gates, came out with guitars and in bright clothes, and with prayers to the fathers of God, asking them to show mercy to them and drive away the Macedonians. When the Macedonians saw them coming confidently towards them, they were so stunned that, if one may say so, the unarmed frightened the armed. They immediately broke their battle formation, and not only did they not destroy the city, but they also returned those people who had been captured in the attack while they were outside. After that, they formed an alliance and returned to their borders. After a long time, remembering this treachery, the famous Gothic leader Sidalces gathered 150,000 men and attacked the Athenians and the Macedonian king Perdiccas, whom Alexander, having found his death in Babylon thanks to the intrigues of his servants, had left him as his successor in the Athenian state on the basis of hereditary rights. After engaging in a great battle with him, the Goths prevailed, and because of the damage the Macedonians had once inflicted on Mysia, the Goths spread throughout Greece and devastated the whole of Macedonia. Then, during the reign of Bravista among the Goths, Decianus arrived in Gothia at the same time that Sulla seized power in Rome. Bravista accepted Decianus and gave him almost royal power. On his advice, the Goths ravaged the lands of the Germans, which are now in the possession of the Franks. Caesar, the first of all who appropriated imperial power in Rome for himself, who subjugated almost the entire world, failed to conquer the Goths, despite frequent attempts. And when Gaius Tiberius, the third to rule Rome, the Goths still stood unshaken in their kingdom. After the death of Decianus, Camazicus enjoyed almost the same respect among them, because he was his equal in ingenuity. He was both their king and high priest because of his knowledge, and he conducted court cases with the utmost fairness. After he too departed from human affairs, King Coral reigned over the Goths and ruled his tribes in Dacia for 40 years. I'm talking about ancient Dacia, which is now ruled by the Gepids. This country, which lies opposite Mysia across the Danube, is surrounded by a crown of mountains, in which there are only two passes, one before Butaz, the other through Tapas. This Gothia, which the ancestors called Dacia and which now, as we said, is called Gepidia, was then bounded on the east by the Eroxolani, on the west by the Iazyges, on the north by the Sarmatians and the Bastarni, and on the south by the Danube. However, the Iazyges are separated from the Eroxolani only by the Aluta River. Since the Danube is mentioned, it is worth saying something about this great river. Originating in the Alemannian fields, it flows for 1,200 miles from its source to its mouth, where it empties into the Pontus, with 60 rivers resembling a spine, whose ribs are intertwined like a lattice. It is a huge river. In the language of the Bessi, it is called Hister, and along its course it has depths of 200 fathoms. Among other rivers, it surpasses all others in size, with the exception of the Nile. Their genealogy, the first of the heroes, as they themselves recount in their legends, is Gapt, who created Homel. Homel begot Abjus. Abjus begot the one they call Amal, from whom the Amalekites descended. Amal begot Hizarn. Hizarn begot Ostrogoth. Ostrogoth begets Hunil. Hunil begets Atal. Atal begets Achiulf and Oddwulf. Achiulf begets Ansil and Ediulf. Voltavulf and Hermaneric. Germaneric Voltavulf actually begets Valoravans. Valoravans begets Vinitarius. Vinitarius begets Vandaliarius. Vandaliarius begets Teutomer, Valamir, and Teudemir. Teutomer begets Theoderic. Theoderic begets Amalus Santa. Amalus Santa begets Adalaric and Mathis Santa from her husband Euteric, whose lineage is connected to hers in the following way. The aforementioned Hermaneric, son of Agilulf, begot Hunamund. Hunamund begot Torsamund. Torsamund begot Baramund. Baramund in turn gave birth to Veteric. Veteric, in turn, gave birth to Euteric, who, having married Amalasuinta, gave birth to Adalaric. And Mathisuinta, of whom Adalaric died in his childhood, and Mathisuinta married Vitiges, from whom she had no children. The two were brought by Belisarius to Constantinople. And since Vitiges had departed from human affairs, Germanus, a patrician and nephew of Emperor Justinian, took her as his wife and made her a patrician. She bore him a son, also named Germanus. When Germanus died 550 AD, author's note, she wished to remain a widow. The historian Ablatius reports that there on the coast of Pontus, where, as we said, they settled in Scythia, those who occupied the eastern region were led by Ostrogoth, and either because of his name or because of their location in the east, they called themselves Ostrogoths, while the rest were called Visigoths because they occupied the western region and, as we said above, after their crossing of the Danube, they lived for some time in Moesia and Thrace. From them came Emperor Maximinus, the one after Alexander, the son of Mame. And as Symmachus says in his historical book, Maximinus was proclaimed emperor by the soldiers. He was born in Thrace to parents of low status. His father was a Goth named Mika. His mother was a woman named Ababa. He ruled for 3 years, and when he turned his weapons against the Christians, he lost his life along with his power. When Emperor Severus ruled and celebrated his son's birthday, after growing up in a rural environment, Maximinus appeared for military service straight from the pasture. The emperor organized military competitions. Upon learning of them, Maximinus, though half barbarian and a young man, after the prizes were announced, asked the emperor in his own language to allow him to compete with experienced fighters. Severus, amazed by the size of his body, as they say, he was more than 8 feet tall, allowed him to fight with people from the baggage train, but in such a way that they did not throw themselves at each other, so that the soldiers would not be injured by this rough man. Then Maximinus knocked 16 baggage train soldiers to the ground with such ease that, defeating each one individually, he took on the next one without any rest. After winning all the prizes, he was ordered to be sent to the army, and his first service was in the cavalry. On the 3rd day after that, when the emperor arrived at the camp, he saw him mounting his horse in a barbaric manner. Then he ordered the tribune to teach him Roman military discipline. Realizing that he was being addressed, he approached and began to walk alongside him on foot while he was on horseback. Then the emperor spurred his horse to speed up, began to make many circles back and forth to tire him out, and finally asked him, "Sarah, after the gallop, what do you want, Thracian?" "To fight as much as you like, Emperor," he replied. Then Severus jumped off his horse and ordered the most rested of the soldiers to fight him. And he, Maximinus, knocked down 7 of the strongest young men without resting between fights. He was rewarded by Caesar with silver medals with gold chains, and then ordered to join the imperial bodyguards. Later, under Antoninus Caracalla, he commanded troops and increased his fame many times over with his exploits, being promoted through the ranks and to the title of centurion as a reward for his bravery. After Macrinus ascended the throne, Maximinus left military service and for almost 3 years bore the honorary title of tribune, without ever appearing before Macrinus, considering him unworthy of the power he had gained through crime. He then returned to Elagabulus, son of Antoninus Caracalla, leaving his tribune, and then to Alexander, son of Mame, fighting gloriously against the Parthians. When the latter was killed in the military uprising in Mogontiacum, he proclaimed himself emperor without a Senate decision, and he lost all his virtue when he committed extreme atrocities against the Christians, was killed by Pupion and Aquileia, and left the empire to Philip. This tribe became so famous in the part of the world where it settled, i.e., on the Pontic coast and the Scythian land, that it fearlessly held vast expanses of land, so many sea bays, so many river currents, that the Vandals often lay under its right hand, imposed attacks on the Marcomanni, enslaved the kings of the Quadi. When the Romans were ruled by the aforementioned Philip, who before Constantine was the only Christian along with his son, also named Philip, during whose 2nd year of reign Rome celebrated its 1000th anniversary, the Goths, whose support had been cut off, which often happened, were affected and turned from friends into enemies. Although they lived in submission to their kings, they were Roman federates and received annual provisions. What else? Ostrogoth crossed the Danube and ravaged Moesia and Thrace. Philip sent Senator Decius to him. When he reached them and could do nothing with the Geti, he dismissed his soldiers from service and told them to start private lives, since it was because of their negligence that the Goths had crossed the Danube, thus shifting the blame onto his own men and returning to Philip. The soldiers, seeing that after so many difficulties they had been dismissed from military service, turned in anger to the king of the Goths, Ostrogoth, for advice. He accepted them, fired them up with words, and soon ready for war, brought 3,000 of his armed men, calling on the numerous Tafels and Astringians for help. And there were also 3,000 Carpi, a tribe of people very experienced in war, who were often hostile to the Romans. Later, during the reign of Diocletian and Maximian, Caesar Galerius Maximinus defeated them and subjugated them to the Roman state. Having joined them with the Goths in Pucini from the island of Pucina, which lies at the mouth of the Danube, flowing into Pontus, he appointed Argith and Gunthric, the most distinguished men of their people, as their leaders. Soon they crossed the Danube by fording and ravaged Moesia for the second time, then headed for the main city of the country, the glorious Marcianopolis, Devnia. Author's note, besieged it for a long time, but after receiving a ransom, they left. Speaking of Marcianopolis, it is worth saying a few words about its condition. This city was built by Emperor Trajan for the following reason. As they say, his sister Marcia's servant was bathing in his river, whose water was extremely clear and delicious, called Potami, which springs in the center of the city. When the servant wanted to scoop water from the spring, she accidentally dropped the golden vessel she was carrying into the depths. But although it was quite heavy, after a long time it floated up from the bottom. It was very unusual for it to sink into the abyss and then, thanks to the thrust of the water, float back up. Perplexed by this discovery, Trajan decided that some deities were hiding in the spring, and when he founded the city, he named it after his sister, Marcianopolis. If you ask why the Geti and the Gepids are relatives, I will explain in a few words. Remember that at the beginning I told how the Goths came out of the depths of Scandza with their king Barich, bringing only 3 ships to this shore of the ocean, i.e. to Scandza. And of the 3 ships, one, as it happens, arrived later than the others. And as they say, the whole tribe was named after it, because in their language lazy is pronounced Japanta. From here, from the mockery, the name Gepids arose, albeit slightly modified. Without a doubt, they are descended from the Goths and originate from them. And their nickname is not considered inappropriate, because they are distinguished by their slow minds and sluggish movements. And in their homeland, they lived happily while the aforementioned Ostrogoth was alive. After his death, Niva divided the army into 2 parts, sending many to ravage Moesia, knowing that since the emperor neglected it, it was also deprived of defenders. He himself, with 70,000 men, set out for Eutia, i.e. for Novi. Driven away by the local commander Gallus, he headed for Nicopolis, which was well known and located on the Yatra River. The city was built by Trajan, who, in honor of his victory over the Sarmatians, named it Victoria. When Emperor Decius suddenly appeared there, Niva's troops retreated to the nearby Hem Mountain. From there, having tightened his ranks, he headed for Philippopolis. Upon learning of his retreat to assist this city, Emperor Decius crossed the Hem Mountains and appeared at Beroa. And just as he had settled his weary horses and troops to rest, Niva and his Goths attacked him like lightning, destroyed the Roman army, and pursued the emperor with the few who managed to escape towards Eutia through the Alps and Moesia, where the military commander Gallus guarded the border with a large detachment. Having gathered his army there, as well as from Uscus, he began to prepare for war. After a long siege, Niva invaded Philippopolis, obtained booty, and turned the local chieftain Priscus into an ally, ostensibly to oppose Decius. When they entered the battle, they shot Decius' son with an arrow and mortally wounded him. Seeing this, the father, as they say, shouted to raise the morale of his troops. Let no one grieve. The death of one warrior is not a great loss to the state, but unable to overcome his grief, the father rushed into battle, either to die or to seek revenge, and at Abritus and Mesha, he was surrounded by the Goths and killed, thus bringing an end to his reign and his life. This place is still called the Altar of Decius, because it was there that he made a lavish sacrifice to the idols before the battle. Then a certain Emilian, seeing that the Goths often ravaged Mesha because of the emperor's neglect, thought he could take it without much loss to the state, and imagined that his luck might strike here. He seized power in Mesha tyrannically, took control of the entire army, and subjected the cities and the population to destruction. Within a few months, while the necessary military equipment was being gathered to fight him, he caused considerable damage to the state. However, by embarking on this dirty business, he perished at the very beginning, losing his life and the power he had sought. Emperors Gallus and Volusianus, although they were in power for only 2 years, after which they left this world, during that very 2-year period when they held power, imposed peace everywhere and ruled justly in everything. Only one thing was missing for their good fortune, namely the general plague, and that was the fault of the ignorant and slanderers, accustomed to maliciously gossiping about the lives of others. These emperors, as soon as they came to power, made peace with the Gothic tribes. Soon after the 2 rulers fell, GGL took the principle giving free rein to their unbridled nature. Respa, Vitor, and Tarvar, leaders of the Voscians, crossed over to Asia, sailing across the Hellespont, and in that province they ravaged many cities. Ephesus, they burned the famous temple of Diana, which, as we said earlier, was built by the Amazons. Passing into Bithynia, they destroyed Chalcedon, which was later partially restored. Cornelius a bit with this luck for the Goths, who invaded part of Asia, plundered their spoils, and crossed the Hellespont, ravaging Troy and Ilion along the way, which had barely managed to recover after Agamemnon's war. They were again destroyed by the enemy's sword. After this devastation, Asia, their atrocities were experienced by Thrace. There they approached and advanced against the city of Anchialus, by the sea at the foot of Mount Haemus. This city, once between the sea coast and the mountain slopes, was built by Sardanapalus, king of the Parthians. It is said that the Goths remained there for many days, delighted by the baths and hot springs, located 12 miles from Anchialus, where fiery springs gush forth from the depths. Among all the countless places with hot springs, these undoubtedly rank first and are most effective for the health of the suffering. The tribe described above, the Aerili, as reported by the historian Ablatius, lived near Lake Meotia in marshy areas, which the Greeks called Ili, and therefore were called Illuri, a nomadic tribe and extremely arrogant. Until then, there had not been a single people that had not recruited lightly armed soldiers from among them for themselves, although their speed often allowed them to escape their enemies, and they yielded to the steadfastness and orderliness of the Goths. By the will of fate, they and the other tribes submitted to the king of the Geti, Hermanarich, Germanarich. After the defeat of the Herulls, Hermanarich turned his weapons against the Veneti, who on the one hand were contemptible in their use of weapons, but on the other hand were strong because of their great numbers and were the first to attempt to resist. But a multitude unfit for war is worthless, especially in such cases when the Lord abandons you and many armed men attack you. Those whom we have already mentioned at the beginning when discussing the tribes come from the same root and are known by 3 names: Veneti, Angi, and Sclavini, who, although they now rage everywhere because of our sins, then submitted to the authority of Hermanarich. With wisdom and valor, he subjugated the tribe of the Sdi, who inhabited the last forests of the Germanic Ocean, thus ruling over all the tribes of Scythia and Germania as his own property. Not long after that, as Orosius reports, the tribe of the Huns descended upon the Goths, the most terrifying of all in their savagery. Ancient legends tell us where they came from. The Goths, led by Philomer, son of the great Gedarich, after emigrating from the island of Scandza, as we have said, entered the land of the Scythians, where he found several sorceresses, witches, in his tribe, whom he called Hilurani 5 in his father's language. considering them suspicious, he drove them out of his army and, putting them to flight, abandoned them to wander far away in the wilderness. When they wandered in the barren spaces and encountered unclean spirits, they copulated in their arms and thus produced this most ferocious tribe, which at first lived among the swamps, short, ugly, and emaciated, resembling the human race only in that they uttered something resembling human speech. Thus created from such roots, the Huns came to the borders of the Goths. This fierce nation, as reported by the historian Priscus, settled on the distant shore of the Meotian marsh and knew nothing else but hunting, and if we do not take into account the fact that it grew to the size of a people and began to disturb the neighboring tribes with treachery and plunder. The hunters of this tribe, once as usual searching for game on the shore of the inner Meotian, noticed a deer in front of them, which entered the lake and then stepped forward, then stopped, as if showing them the way. Pursuing it, the hunters crossed the Meotian marsh on foot, which they considered impassable like the sea. Right in front of them appeared the unknown Scythian land, and the deer disappeared. I believe that this was done by the spirits from whom the Huns originated out of hatred for the Scythians. Unaware that there was another world beyond the Meotida, they were delighted with the Scythian land and realized that this previously unknown path had been shown to them from above. They rushed to their people, told them about what had happened, praised Scythia, and convinced the whole tribe to set off on the path they had learned about after it had been shown to them by the deer. All the Scythians whom they had captured upon their arrival were sacrificed in honor of the victory, and the rest, once subdued, were made to submit to them. And as soon as they crossed the marsh, like a hurricane of people, they conquered the local Alpidzuri, Altsiduri, Itamari, Tunkars, and Boise who inhabited this coast of Scythia. The Alans, although equal to them in battle, but differing from them in their greater humanity, way of life, and appearance, were also subjugated, having been exhausted by frequent clashes. They probably defeated them not so much in war as by instilling terror with their terrifying appearance, causing them to flee, because their appearance was frightening with its blackness, which did not resemble a face, but if one may say so, a disfigured lump with slits instead of eyes. Their disfigured appearance betrays a cruel spirit, and they treat even children brutally from birth. They cut the cheeks of male children, so that even before they taste milk, they experience pain from their wounds. Therefore, they grow old, beardless, deprived of beauty in their youth because their faces are disfigured by iron, and the beauty of their hair is erased by the cuts on it. They are short in stature, but agile in their movements and prefer to ride horses. They are broad-shouldered, skilled in archery, and thanks to their strong necks, they always stand tall with superiority. Although they live in human bodies, they live like wild beasts. When the Geti saw this warlike people pursuing many tribes, they were frightened and began to consult with their king on how to avoid this enemy. Although the king of the Goths, Hermanrich, Germanrich, as we said above, was the conqueror of many tribes, after the appearance of the Huns he had second thoughts. The treacherous tribe of the Rosamones, who then served him along with other tribes, happened to take advantage of this to betray him. A woman from the aforementioned tribe, named Sinilda, betrayed her husband, and the king, driven by anger, ordered her to be torn to pieces by tying her to wild horses and then spurring them on. Her brothers Sar and Ami, in revenge for their sister's death, wounded Hermanrich in the hip with a sword. Tormented by this wound, the king lived out his life as a sick man. When he learned of his unfortunate wound, Balambur, king of the Huns, went to war against this group, the Ostrogoths, from whom the Visigoths had already separated according to their plan. Meanwhile, Hermanrich, so wounded and gloomy, could not bear the raids of the Huns and ended his days in the 100th year of his life. His death enabled the Huns to defeat those Goths who occupied their eastern side and were called Ostrogoths. The Visigoths, their compatriots who inhabited their western regions, frightened by the fear of their relatives, hesitated what position to take towards the Huns, deliberated at length, and finally, by mutual agreement, sent an embassy to Romania, the Roman Empire, to Emperor Valens, brother of Emperor Valentinian the Elder, to live under his rule and according to his laws, if he would allow them to settle in parts of Thrace or Moesia, and to be even more loyal to him. They promised to convert to Christianity if teachers of their language were sent to them. Upon receiving this news, Valens immediately and gladly agreed to what he himself, incidentally, had been thinking of asking them to do, accepted the Geti in Moesia, and placed them as a wall in front of his country against other tribes. And since Emperor Valens himself, carried away by the false Arian doctrine, closed all the churches of our faith, he sent preachers from his sect to them, and when they arrived here, they began to infect these rough and ignorant people with the contagion of their false doctrine. Thus, thanks to Valens, the Visigoths became Arians instead of Christians. Later, with their evangelical preachers, they enlightened both the Ostrogoths and their relatives, the Gepids, to worship the secret doctrine, so that they attracted all the tribes of their language to accept this sect into their lives. They in turn, as was said, crossed the Danube and settled in coastal Dacia, in Moesia, and in both Thracia. And as usually happens with peoples who are not well established in a new place, they were overtaken by poverty and famine, and then their leaders and chiefs, who ruled them instead of kings, namely Fritigern, Eladius, and Saphrax, because of the needs of their army, asked the Roman generals Lipicinus and Maximus to open a market. Truly, what can the accursed thirst for gold not lead to? Driven by greed, the military leaders allowed not only sheep and beef to be sold, but also the carcasses of dogs and other unclean animals, and at a high price. Things got to the point where any slave could be bought for a loaf of bread or 10 pounds of beef. When there were no slaves or possessions left, the greedy merchant demanded their sons. Seeing salvation for their children, the parents acted on the conclusion that it was easier to lose their freedom than their lives, even though it was more merciful to be sold and fed in the future than to stay with them and die. During these disasters, the Roman praetor Lipicinus invited the Gothic prince Fritigern to a feast and devised a treacherous plan for him. However, Fritigern, unaware of the conspiracy, arrived at the feast with a small retinue, and while they were eating in the praetor's guest room, he heard the cries of the unfortunate victims. The soldiers of the military commander, on his orders, had tried to kill his Fritigern's companions, who had been pushed into another room. However, the loud cries of the dying were heard by Fritigern, who had sharp ears. He uncovered the deception, drew his sword, jumped out of the feast, and with great courage and determination saved his companions from certain death, inspiring them to kill the Romans. At this turn of events, these brave men decided to die in battle rather than from hunger, and immediately drew their weapons to kill Lipicinus and Maximus. And that day took with it both the hunger of the Goths and the safety of the Romans. After that, the Goths began to rule over the farmers and hold all the northern regions up to the Danube in their power, no longer as strangers and immigrants, but as citizens and masters. Upon learning of this while in Antioch, Emperor Valens armed his troops and arrived at the borders of Thrace. After an unfortunate battle there, which ended in victory for the Goths, the emperor fled to a farmstead near Adrianople and hid in a small building. The Goths, unaware that he was hiding there, set fire to it from below, as was characteristic of the savage enemy, and burned him in royal splendor. So it happened, almost as if by divine judgment, that he was burned by the very people whom he had persuaded to false teachings when they asked him for true faith, and the fire of love turned into hellfire. From those times, the Visigoths, after such a great and glorious victory, settled in both Thrace and coastal Dacia and began to rule them as citizens by birth. After that, when Theodosius, a native of Spain, was chosen by Emperor Gratian and placed in the Eastern Principality in place of his uncle Valens. Military affairs were quickly brought to a better state, and idleness was eliminated. But then Theodosius fell ill, and his condition became hopeless. The Goths became bold again. Fritigern divided his army and set out to plunder Thessaly, Epirus, and Achaia, while Eladius and Saphrycus attacked Pannonia with the rest of the hordes. Then Emperor Gratian, who had come to Gaul because of the invasion of the Vandals from Rome, learned that because of Theodosius' hopeless condition, the Goths had intensified their pressure, immediately gathered his army, appeared there, made peace with them, and concluded an alliance, not with weapons, but by winning them over with gifts and giving them provisions. During the consulate of Theodosius and Festus, having broken the peace, the Romans went to war in Gaul against Theodoric, joining forces with auxiliary troops from the Huns. They were disturbed by the strength of the Gothic Federate army with which Count Gainas had trampled Constantinople. At that time, the commander was Aetius, who came from the most powerful missions in Duroster. His father, Gaudentius, was a skilled military man, useful only to the Roman state, for after heavy wars with the arrogant barbarism of the Savan Franks, he forced them to serve the Roman Empire. The Roman army under the command of Latorian, with the help of Hun troops, marched against the Goths, and the armies stood facing each other for a long time, both sides being strong and neither side proving weak. Then, shaking hands, they returned to their previous agreement, and after an alliance was concluded and a strong peace established for both sides, they dispersed. Attila, lord of all the Huns and the only ruler in the world of the tribes known throughout Scythia, most famous for his glorious fame among all nations, also participated in this peace treaty. The historian Priscus, sent on an embassy to him by Theodosius the Younger, recounts the following. After crossing large rivers, namely the Tisza, Tebissa, and Dryca, we arrived at the place where Vitigoia, the bravest of the Goths, had perished due to Sarmatian treachery. From there, we reached the settlement where King Attila had settled, which was not far away. This settlement was as large as the most spacious city, whose wooden walls, as we noticed, were made of smoothly polished boards that were so tightly joined that the joints between them were barely noticeable. There were also dining rooms stretching far away and arches of magnificent beauty. The square was surrounded by a high fence, whose height alone testified to the scale of the palace. This was the palace of Attila, the ruler of the entire barbarian world, who preferred to dwell in such homes in the conquered lands. Attila himself was born to Munzuk, who had brothers Octor and Roa, who, as they say, held power before Attila, though not within the same borders as he did. After their death, Attila and his brother Bleda succeeded them in the kingdom of the Huns, after his brother Bleda, who ruled over a large part of the Huns, was treacherously killed. He, Attila, united all the peoples, and having gathered all the tribes that he then held in subjection, decided to conquer the peoples who were the leaders of the world, the Romans and the Visigoths. It was said that his army numbered 500,000 men. He was a man born into this world to terrify the whole earth, who, by some unknown fate, inspired fear in everyone, known everywhere for his terrifying appearance. He attacked with arrogance, casting glances here and there, and demonstrating the power of his arrogance with his body movements. A lover of war, he was moderate in his actions, strongest in his reasoning, yielding to those who begged him, merciful to those he had once trusted. He was short in stature, broad-chested, with a large head and small eyes, a sparse beard, streaks of gray, a flat nose, and a repulsive complexion, displaying all the marks of his origins. Although by nature he had always believed in himself, his self-confidence grew even more after the discovery of the Sword of Mars, which had always been considered sacred by the Scythian kings, as recounted by the historian Priscus. A shepherd, he says, noticed that when a heifer from his herd limped and he could not find a reason for her injury, he followed the bloody tracks in bewilderment until he came to the sword, which she had accidentally stepped on while grazing. The shepherd immediately dug it up and took it to Attila. He thanked him for the gift and, proud as he was, became even more convinced that he was destined to rule the world and that through Mars' sword, he was allowed to be the strongest in war. Realizing that Attila's plans envisaged the destruction of the world, Getica, the king of the Vandals mentioned above, tried in every way to push him into war against the Visigoths with gifts, fearing that Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, would take revenge for the humiliation of his daughter, who had been given in marriage to Honoric, son of Getica. Then Attila, starting the war provoked by bribes from Guzeric, sent envoys to Italy to Emperor Valentinian, thus sowing discord between the Goths and the Romans so that their enmity would achieve what he could not achieve through battle. At the same time, he gave assurances that he was not violating his friendship with the empire in any way, but was only opposing Theodoric, king of the Visigoths. In his desire for this to be accepted graciously, he filled the rest of his letter with false words and greetings, trying to win trust with lies. At the same time, he sent a letter to Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, advising him to break off his alliance with the Romans and remember the struggle that had recently been waged against him. Beneath his excessive ferocity lay a cunning man who, before starting a war, skillfully concealed himself. Then Emperor Valentinian sent a delegation to the Visigoths and their king Theodoric with the following message: "Most valiant tribe, it would be wise for you to join forces with us against the tyrant who is attacking the whole world without seeking reasons for war and considers everything he does to be lawful. He measures his ambition with his right hand and his arrogance with his willfulness. He despises justice and God's law and elevates himself as an enemy of nature itself. True universal hatred is deserved by those who declare themselves enemies of all. Please remember, although it is impossible to forget, that the Huns do not wage war in the open, where misfortune is the same for all. But what is frightening is that they prepare treacherous ambushes. Even if I remain silent, you will hardly be able to refrain from avenging such insolence. You, strong with your weapons, think about your suffering, unite all your troops. In this way, help the state of which you are a member, and how desirable and how valuable this alliance is to us. Ask the enemy for his opinion." With these and other similar words, Valentinian's legates deeply moved King Theodoric, and he replied, "Your wish, Romans, is granted. You have made Attila our enemy, and we will attack him wherever he challenges us to battle. And even though he has become proud of his victories over other nations, the Goths also know how to fight the proud." The king's companions applauded his answer, and the people joyfully repeated it. All were seized with a desire for battle, and all hurled threats at their Hun enemies. And so Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, led out a countless multitude, leaving only his 4 sons at home, namely, Frederick and Uric, Re-Timorim and Himnerit, taking with him to war only the eldest, Torismod and Theodoric. On the Roman side, the patrician Aetius, who was responsible for the Hesperian region, showed great prudence. He gathered troops from all over so as not to be outnumbered by the fierce and countless hordes. He recruited the following auxiliary troops: Franks, Sarmatians, Armoricans, Lycians, Burgundians, Saxons, Riparians, Olybrians, who were former Roman soldiers but had now been enlisted in the auxiliary troops, and many others from the Celtic and Germanic peoples. And so they gathered on the Catalonian plain, also called Mauriac, which stretches 100 leagues in length, according to the Gauls, and 70 in width. This piece of land became a battlefield for countless tribes. Here, the bravest fighting units from both sides gathered, without any hidden maneuvers, and fought in open field. But before we say anything about the course of the battle itself, it is necessary to see what happened before that. A battle as glorious as it was diverse and complex. Sangiban, the king of the Alans, fearing for the future, promised Attila to surrender and also to hand over the Gallic city of Aurelian, where he had settled at that time. When Theodoric and Aetius learned of this, before Attila arrived, they immediately fortified the city with large earthworks, placed the suspicious Sanjaban under their control and stationed him and his people in the center of their auxiliary forces. The king of the Huns, Attila, alarmed by these events and having lost faith in his troops, did not dare to engage in battle. At this stage, considering that flight was much more shameful than death, he ordered a divination of the future to be performed. They, according to their custom, examined the entrails of an animal and, based on certain veins separated from the bones, announced that the Huns were threatened with misfortune. The only small consolation in this prediction was that the enemy leader would fall and his death would overshadow their victory. In view of this prediction, Attila decided that, at the cost of his own life, he must kill Aetius, who had once again blocked his path. Being extremely resourceful in military matters, he began the battle at the 9th hour of the day, counting on the fact that if things went badly for him, the approaching night would come to his aid. As we said, the two armies arrived at the Catalonian plain. This place was flat, but it seemed as if it had swelled up to form a hill with a peak. Both armies wanted to capture this place because its advantages offered considerable advantages. Thus, the Huns and their allies occupied its right side, while the Romans and Visigoths with their auxiliaries occupied its left side, and they engaged in battle for the remaining, unoccupied peak. The right wing was led by Theoderic with the Visigoths, the left by Aetius with the Romans, and in the middle was Sanjaban, who led the Alans and whom we mentioned above. They were guided by military prudence towards the one whose mood they did not trust, and he was surrounded by loyal people. This way, he could be more easily forced to fight, since escape would be impeded. The ranks of the Huns were arranged differently. Attila was positioned in the middle with his bravest warriors, and thus the king was protected because, being positioned among the strongest members of his tribe, he was safe from the advancing enemies. The wings of his army consisted of numerous peoples and different tribes who were subject to his authority. Among them were the Ostrogoth troops, led by the brothers Velamir, Theodomir, and Vidmar, who were of nobler birth than the king they served, because they shone through the power of the Amal clan. There was also the famous Arderich, king of the numerous hordes of the Gepids, who, with his unreserved friendship for Attila, participated in all his plans. With his quick wit, the perceptive Attila loved him and the king of the Ostrogoths, Valamir, more than the other princes. Valamir was secretive, affable in conversation, and perceptive against treachery, while Arderich was loyal, as we have said, and brilliant, and he was confident that they would fight against their compatriots, the Visigoths. The rest, if one may say so, a crowd of kings and chiefs of various tribes, waited like satellites for Attila's nod and glance, and appeared before him meekly in fear and trembling, and did what they were commanded. Only Attila, emperor of all kings, stood above everyone and worried about everyone. After all, it was a matter of gaining control of the advantageous position of this area, as we said. Attila sent his men to occupy the top of the hill, but Torsimund and Aetius got there first and climbed to the top of the hill, and finding themselves higher up, they easily repelled the approaching Huns thanks to this advantage. There, King Theodoric, while touring his troops to encourage them, was thrown from his horse and trampled by the feet of his own men, thus ending his life, having reached a ripe old age. Some say that he was killed with a spear by Andages on the side of the Ostrogoths, who were then under Attila's command. It happened just as the soothsayers had predicted to Attila at the beginning, although he thought it was about Aetius. Then the Visigoths, who had separated from the Alans, attacked the Hunnic hordes and almost killed Attila, if he had not foreseen the danger, fled, and hidden himself with his people behind the fences of the camps, which he defended with ramparts surrounded by carts. Although this defense was fragile, behind it those who had previously been unable to build any stone fortifications sought refuge. Torsimund, the son of King Theodorid, who together with Aetius had initially occupied the hill and driven the enemies from its heights, thinking he was approaching his troops, stumbled upon the enemy's carts in the dark night without suspecting anything. He bravely defended himself, but was wounded in the head and thrown from his horse. When his men found him and freed him, he refused to fight anymore. Aetius, similarly, having broken away from his men in the night's confusion, wandering among the enemies and worried that something bad had happened to the Goths, finally came to the Allied camp and spent the rest of the night under the protection of shields. The next day at sunrise, the Romans noticed that the field was littered with corpses, and the Huns did not dare to show themselves. They considered the victory theirs, calculating that Attila would only give up military action when threatened with defeat in war, but he did nothing to show that he was defeated and humiliated. On the contrary, he rattled his weapons, blew his trumpets, and imitated attacks. He looked like a lion cornered by hunters' spears in front of a cave, where he was tormented by his wounds. No longer daring to rise on his hind legs, he still did not stop roaring to fill the surroundings with his voice. Thus, this warlike king, though besieged, frightened his conquerors. Then the Goths and the Aemilians gathered to consider what to do with Attila. They decided to wear him down with a siege, as he had no bread supplies, and his supplies were blocked by archers who were constantly shooting from inside the camp. They say that even in this desperate situation, the so-called emperor did not lose his composure. He built a pyre out of horse saddles and planned to throw himself into the fire if the enemies invaded, so that no one could rejoice at his injury and the lord of so many nations would not fall into the hands of his enemies. During this stay and siege, surprised by his absence, the Visigoths began to search for their king and the sons for their father. They searched for him for a long time and found him in a thick pile of corpses, as befits a brave man, and carried him out of there before the eyes of the enemies with respectful songs. Having paid their respects to Theodoric, the Goths rattled their weapons, surrendered the royal power, and Torsamud, as befits a son, escorted the glorious remains of his noble father in a funeral procession. When everything was over, the son, driven by the pain of being orphaned and in a burst of courage, planned to avenge his father's death on the remaining Huns and asked the patrician Aetius, as the eldest and most reasonable, what they should do next. Fearing that if the Huns were completely destroyed, the Goths would put pressure on the Roman Empire, he gave the following advice. He should return to his own lands and assume the royal power left by his father, lest his brothers take away his father's treasures and forcefully invade the kingdom of the Visigoths, forcing him to be cruel or, even worse, to wage war against his own people. He accepted this advice unequivocally and to his advantage, left the Huns, and returned to Gaul. In this famous war between the most powerful tribes on both sides, 165,000 people died, excluding 15,000 Franks and Gepids who met on the night before the main battle and slaughtered each other. The Franks on the side of the Romans, the Gepids on the side of the Huns. Attila, noticing the departure of the Goths, suspected some military trickery, as is usually thought of something inexplicable, and remained in the camp for a long time. But after a prolonged silence following the retreat of the enemies, his mind was inspired by victory. Joy grew, and the power of his spirit restored the king's old faith in fate. And Torsamud, after the death of his father in the Catalonian field, where they fought, returned to Toulouse and was elevated to royal power. Attila, taking advantage of the retreat of the Visigoths and noticing the disintegration between the enemies of the two camps, which often happens, confidently directed his troops to press the Romans, and his first action was to besiege the city of the Aquiliani, which was the capital of the Venetians. This city is located on a sharp cape or tongue of land jutting into the Adriatic Gulf, which is washed on the east by the Natisa River, which springs from Mount Pixa. After a long siege, he was unable to do anything. Inside the city, the strongest Roman soldiers were resisting, and his troops were already discontented and wanted to leave. Once, as Attila was walking around the walls and wondering whether to break camp or stay a little longer, he suddenly noticed that some snow-white birds, namely storks, which nested on the tops of the houses, were leading their chicks out of the city and, contrary to their instincts, were taking them somewhere in the field. And because he was very observant and thoughtful, he presented the following considerations to his entourage. "Look at these birds," he said. "Foreseeing the future, they are leaving the city, which is threatened with destruction. They are fleeing from the fortifications that will fall because some danger is looming over them. This is not in vain. It should not be believed that, sensing events and fearing the future, they change their habits." And what happened next? With this, he once again ignited the spirits of his people to conquer Aquileia. Having built siege engines and using all kinds of projectile weapons, they slowly penetrated the city, plundered it, divided the spoils, and ravaged it with such cruelty that, as they say, they left no trace of the city. Then, even more daring and insatiable for Roman blood, the Huns rampaged through the other cities of Venetia. They devastated Mediolanum, the main city and former capital of Liguria, razed Ticinus to the ground, fiercely destroying the surrounding areas, and finally almost destroyed the whole of Italy. When Attila thought of going to Rome, his close associates, as the historian Priscus says, dissuaded him, not because they thought of the city as hostile, but because they had in mind the example of Alaric, the former king of the Visigoths, and feared for the fate of their king, because after the conquest of Rome, he did not live long and, after his first actions, parted with human life. And while his spirit wavered about the dangerous undertaking of whether to go or not, he pondered alone and delayed. A peaceful delegation from Rome came to him. Pope Leo himself appeared before him on the Ambulian field in Venetia, where the river Mincius is crossed by a bridge by many travelers. Then Attila stopped his army's actions and, returning it to where it had come from, set off on the road to the Danube, observing peace, but publicly declaring and threatening that he would bring even greater misfortune to Italy if they did not send him Honoria, sister of Prince Valentinian, the daughter of Placidius Augustus, along with her share of the royal treasures. It is said that Honoria, by her brother's will, was kept in captivity as a hostage for the honor of the state, but she secretly sent her eunuch to Attila to ask him to save her from her brother's lust for power. It was a totally messed up thing to do, buying freedom for her lust at the expense of the state. Attila returned to his capital and, tired of inaction and the difficult end of the war, sent a delegation to the eastern Prince Marcian with the threat that he would plunder the province because they did not pay him the taxes promised by the late Emperor Theodosius and were treating him more inhumanely than their enemies. Acting in this way, cunning and deceitful, he threatened on the one hand and drew his weapons on the other, pouring out the excess of his indignation on the Visigoths. But here he did not achieve the same result as with the Romans. Returning by other routes than those prescribed, he decided to subjugate that part of the Alans who were beyond the river Liguri, so that after their defeat in battle, he would become an even greater threat. And so, setting out from the provinces of Dacia and Pannonia, where the Huns and other tribes subordinate to them lived, Attila raised his army against the Alans. But Torsimud, the king of the Visigoths, with no less foresight than Attila, sensed his treacherous plan and quickly united with the Alans and, already prepared, met the advancing armies of Attila. Such a powerful battle ensued, similar to the one on the Catalonian plain, that it deprived him of any hope of victory, drove him from his borders without triumph, and forced him to return to his former borders. Thus, the glorious Attila, who had won many victories, when he wished to humiliate and destroy his enemy, experienced twice what he had once experienced from the Visigoths, and retreated in disgrace. It is known about the genealogy and deeds of the Ostrogoths that after the death of their king Germaneric, they separated from the Visigoths and submitted to the authority of the Huns, remaining in that country, whereby Vinitarius of the Amal clan retained all the attributes of a ruler. Imitating the valor of his grandfather Voltulf, although he was inferior to Hermaneric in luck and success, he bitterly endured his subjugation to the Huns. Shortly after freeing himself from their power and testing his bravery, he attacked the ants with weapons, but was defeated in the first battle. However, he subsequently began to act more decisively and crucified their king Boz, with his sons and 70 elders as a deterrent, so that the corpses of those crucified would double the fear of the subjugated. But he ruled with such freedom for only a year, which Balamber, the king of the Huns, could not tolerate, and he summoned Gesamund, the son of the great Hunamund, who, remembering his oath of allegiance, obeyed the Huns with a significant part of the Goths, and, renewing his alliance with them, led an army against Vinitarius. They fought long in the first battle, and in the second battle Vinitarius emerged victorious. It is hardly possible for anyone to remember a defeat similar to the one Vinitarius inflicted on the Huns. But in the third battle, when the two armies approached each other, Balamber, stepping into the Iraq River, shot an arrow, hitting Vinitarius in the head and killing him, and then took his niece Vatamirka as his wife, and from that moment began to rule over all the conquered tribes of the Goths in the world, but in such a way that the Gothic tribes were always ruled by their own prince, but with the consent of the Huns. And as the priest Prisk recounts, at the time of his death, Attila took as his wife the girl of exceptional beauty Itiko, even though he had countless wives, as was the custom of this people. As a result of the excessive revelry at the wedding and his participation in it, exhausted by wine and sleep, he fell on his back covered in blood, which usually flowed from his nostrils, but now, gathering in its natural course, unfortunately flowed into his throat and suffocated him. Thus, the king, renowned in war, met his end from shameful intoxication. The next day, when most of it had already drained away, the king's servants suspected something tragic had happened. After shouting loudly, they broke down the doors and entered, finding Attila dead from blood loss, with no injuries, and next to him the girl with her face covered in tears under her veil. Then, according to the custom of their tribe, they cut off part of their hair and disfigured their ugly faces with deep wounds to mourn the exceptional warrior, not with cries and tears like women, but with the blood of men. In connection with this, the following miracle occurred. Marcian, prince of the East, troubled by such a fierce enemy, saw a deity in his dream that very night, who showed him Attila's broken bow, precisely because this tribe used this weapon a lot. The historian Priscus says that he can confirm this with real evidence. Attila seemed so scary to the big empires that his death was announced from above as a royal gift. We will not fail to mention how this tribe honored his remains, few as they were. In the middle of the steppe, they laid his body in a silk tent, and it was an extremely solemn sight. Selected horsemen from the entire Hun people rode around the place where he was laid to rest, and at the same time mentioned his military exploits in funeral psalms. The great king of the Huns, Attila, born of his father Munzuk, lord of the strongest tribes, you with unprecedented might conquered the kingdoms of Scythia and Germany, after the horror of conquering cities in the two Roman empires, so that the rest would not be subjected to plunder, appeased by pleas, accepted an annual tax from them. And all this ended happily. He did not die from enemy wounds, nor from the treachery of his own people, but in joy and merriment, without pain, when the people were present, whole and unharmed. Who will accept this as the end, when no one is subject to revenge? After he is mourned with such lamentations, they spread memorial dishes on his grave and remember him with a feast, and mixing their feelings together, they express grief and rejoicing. And at night, they secretly bury the corpse in the ground, placing it inaccessible under 3 lids, the first of gold, the second of silver, and the third of strong iron, explaining that this is fitting for the most powerful king of all, iron, because he conquered nations, gold and silver, because he acquired both empires as adornments. Here they place the weapons captured in battle from their enemies, various expensive breastplates, colorful, sparkling precious stones, and various types of decorations, such as those used in the palace. And to prevent human curiosity about such great riches, they killed all those who were involved in this burial. Such a disgusting reward. Instant death befell the buriers, as it did the buried. After everything was over, a dispute arose among Attila's heirs over power, and with the spirit of youth characteristic of them, they competed for the honor of ruling. Still unreasonable in their desire for all to take power, all lost it. Thus, wealth, rather than poverty, often becomes a burden to the kingdom. Attila's sons, who because of his licentiousness had become quite a people, asked to divide the tribes equally by lot, to cast lots for the warlike kings along with their peoples, like servants. Thus, after numerous and heavy battles, victory suddenly turned in favor of the Gepids. About 30,000 Huns and other tribes that supported the Huns, together with all the rebels, killed Ardaric with the sword. Attila's eldest son, called Elic, also died in this battle. It is said that his father loved him much more than the others and preferred him above all others to sit next to his throne. But fate did not sympathize with the father's desire. After killing many enemies, he died, as is well known, so bravely that his father would have wished for such a death had he been alive. After his death, his other brothers fled to the shores of the Pontic Sea, where, as we described earlier, the Goths had previously settled. The Huns retreated as if the universe itself were retreating. Thus, thanks to Ardaric, king of the Gepids, happiness came to various tribes who had been subjugated against their will by the Huns, and their spirits, which had long been sunk in deep sorrow, were filled with joy at their desired liberation. And when many of them appeared as a delegation on Roman soil and were received with the highest mercy by the then Emperor Marcian, they received the lands assigned to them, where they settled. Then the Gepids, having seized the lands of the Huns by force, conquered Dacia in its entirety as victors, and as businesslike people, they asked nothing of the Roman Empire except peace and annual gifts under a treaty of friendship. The emperor gladly agreed to this, and to this day, this tribe receives gifts from the Roman emperor. When the Goths saw that the Gepids had kept the lands of the Huns for themselves, and that the Huns had returned to their old places, they preferred to beg for land from the Roman Empire rather than risk conquering foreign lands, and they received Pannonia. It stretches across a long plain, with Upper Moesia to the east, Dalmatia to the south, Noricum to the west, and the Danube to the north. The country is adorned with many cities, the first of which is Sirmium, and the last is Vindeman. The Sarmatians, whom we also call Sarmatians and Semens, and some of the Huns settled in places in Illyricum, given to them around the city of Castramartin. From these tribes are Blivola, chief of Pentapolis, his brother Froila, and the patrician of our time, Bess. The Scythians, the Satigars, and part of the Alans, whose chief was named Candac, received Little Scythia and Lower Moesia. The notary of this Candac, Alan of Imutus, until his death was Parion, my grandfather. Guntigus, the son of Candac's sister, whom they called Osh and Baza. Magister Militum, son of Andiges, who was the son of Andal from the Amalite clan, was the notary until my return. I, Jordanes, who had not gone to school. The Rudi and many other tribes managed to settle in Bazim and Arcadiapol. Ernak, Attila's youngest son, chose to settle with his people on the outskirts of Little Scythia. His blood brothers Imnetzer and Vitsinder settled in coastal Dacia near the rivers Ut, Hisco, and Almo, and many Huns flocked there and settled in Romania, Byzantium, where they are still called Sacramontesi and Fossatisi. There were also other Goths who were called small, though a countless people, and they had their own bishop and leader, Wulfila, who, as they say, invented their alphabet. Today, they live in Moesia, settled around Nicopolis at the foot of Haemimont, a numerous but poor and peaceful tribe, which had no riches except herds of cattle, forests, and pastures. Their land was poor in wheat and other grains. Some of them were unfamiliar with wine, whether there was any elsewhere, so they obtained wine from neighboring regions, because most of them drank milk. Let us return to the tribe in question, the Ostrogoths who lived in Pannonia, subjects of King Valamir and his brothers Theodamer and Vitimer. Although their regions were divided, they formed a single entity. It so happened that Attila's sons attacked the Goths, who were seeking to escape their rule, and, searching for escaped slaves, they attacked only Valamir, while the other brothers suspected nothing. But although he met them with few forces, he wore them down and achieved victory, so that few of the enemies remained, and they fled to those regions in Scythia where the waters of the Dnieper River flow, which the Huns call Var in their language.